It didn't hit you like lightning. It was quieter than that. Maybe it came after a breakdown, or during a meditation where everything suddenly clicked or fell apart. One day, you just saw it, the illusion, the endless chase, the masks, the game. And for a moment, everything made sense. There was peace, stillness, maybe even power. You thought, this is it. I finally woke up. But then, something strange happened. Days passed, then weeks. The high faded. You stopped chasing, but not in a peaceful way, more like your inner fire just dimmed. You weren't sad. You weren't angry. You just didn't care like you used to. The goals that once lit you up now feel hollow. The ambitions that used to drive you feel like someone else's dream. You're not in pain, exactly. But something's missing. Something real. And here's the twist no one talks about. What you're feeling isn't failure. It's not burnout or depression in the typical sense. It's a kind of sacred silence, the void that follows awakening. And if it feels numb, empty, or even pointless, you're not alone. Carl Jung, the brilliant mind behind analytical psychology, saw this coming. He didn't call it burnout. He called it transformation. And understanding that is the first step in making peace with what comes next. You probably thought awakening would bring clarity, energy, and purpose, like you'd finally tap into your higher self and everything would fall into place. That's the myth most of us buy into. But Carl Jung, one of the deepest psychological thinkers of the modern age, warned that this stage, the aftermath of awakening, is not a spiritual arrival. It's a psychological death. You see, before awakening, most of us are living through a mask Jung called the persona, the socially acceptable version of ourselves, designed to get approval, stay safe, and function in society. We strive, we hustle, we set goals, and we measure our worth by external results, but awakening tears that mask off. It doesn't ask for your permission. One moment, you believe you're chasing a career, a relationship, a legacy. The next, you see how much of that was never really you, just programming, conditioning, ego. That's why awakening often feels more like grief than freedom. Suddenly, the structures that held your life together, your plans, your ambitions, your identity collapse. You're not chasing the same things, but you also haven't discovered what to chase instead. You're caught in a liminal space, no longer asleep, but not yet fully alive. Jung described this moment as a profound disorientation. Your ego, the part of you that knew how to play the game, has lost its script. It's not dead. It's confused, wandering, wondering what the point of anything is. And here's where most people panic. Our culture doesn't know how to sit in this space. We're taught to bounce back, to stay productive, to find your purpose. But what if the real medicine is to stop trying to fix it? Jung believed this in-between space, what ancient cultures called the void, or the dark night of the soul, is where real transformation begins. Not on the yoga mat, not on the vision board, but here, in the quiet breakdown of the old self. This space isn't depression, it's not laziness, it's a sacred pause. The ego thinks it's a problem to solve. It wants its identity back. It wants the fire of motivation again. But Jung would say, not yet, because this death, this unraveling is necessary. Before something new can grow, the old must fully dissolve. Just like the caterpillar turns into goo before becoming a butterfly, you're in the goo phase. It's not productive, it's not pretty, but it's real. And if you can stay here, not distract, not escape, not rush back to who you were, you create space for something deeper to emerge. Not a new mask, not another role to play, but something authentic, whole, and aligned with your true self. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming the person you were always meant to be, beneath the programming, the expectations, and the noise. So if you're feeling like your life has lost its shape, like you're wandering through fog, understand this: you're not broken, you're becoming. And this confusion isn't the end of your awakening. It's the doorway into it. If you've awakened to some deeper truth, only to find yourself stuck in a kind of limbo, no longer inspired by your goals, passions, or even your daily routines. You're not broken, you're not lazy, you're not regressing. What you're experiencing is what Carl Jung would call a necessary and sacred shift, the void phase. It's that uncomfortable stretch of time after awakening when everything familiar loses its flavor and nothing new has fully taken shape. This is the part no one talks about in spiritual circles. We're sold the image of awakening as a clean, upward journey, a rising into light and bliss. But Jung, always grounded in psychological truth, offered a far more honest roadmap. He understood that deep transformation doesn't look like a glow-up. It looks like a dismantling. It feels like collapse. And most of all, it feels like a loss of energy, mental, emotional, and motivational. Why? Because awakening empties out the fuel that used to drive you. Before, your motivation was powered by the ego, the identity you'd constructed over years. The need to achieve, to be admired, to feel in control. These weren't necessarily toxic motivations, they're just how the ego operates. It sets goals, builds structure, chases meaning through external validation. But awakening reveals that most of what you were striving for was rooted in illusion. The job title, the social media image, the 5-year plan, all of it built on a version of you that no longer exists. So, when that ego structure collapses, it takes the old motivation system down with it. You haven't lost your drive. You've lost the engine that used to run it, and you haven't built a new one yet. This is where Jung's concept of enantiodromia comes in, a term he borrowed from ancient Greek philosophy. It refers to the tendency of things to turn into their opposite over time. Psychologically, it describes a natural pendulum swing that happens when we've over-identified with one extreme. If your entire life was driven by ambition, hustle, and self-improvement, awakening might swing you into stillness, apathy, or disinterest, not because you're failing, but because your psyche is seeking balance. The old go, go, go identity burns out, and what replaces it is a silence that can feel unbearable until you understand it. In myth and archetype, this is the cocoon phase, the hermit archetype, the womb of nothingness before rebirth. Jung would tell you, don't rush this. Don't try to bounce back into productivity. The psyche has its own timing, and what feels like stagnation is often sacred inner work unfolding behind the scenes. Here's the key insight. The void isn't empty. It's full of transformation, but it's happening underneath the surface. Your conscious mind doesn't have access to all of it yet. That's why it feels so disorienting. You're not doing life the old way, but you don't know the new way either. You're between identities, between maps, and that in-between space can feel like freefall. Most people panic here. They reach for old habits, they numb out, or they create a new spiritual identity, another mask, to avoid the discomfort. But Jung warned against this kind of bypassing. He said that avoiding the void is what leads to neurosis. It's when we try to skip the death part of transformation that we trap ourselves in confusion. But if you stay, if you breathe through the discomfort and allow the pause, something deeper starts to surface. The self, in Jungian terms, begins to stir. Not the ego self that wants recognition, but the deep center of your being. And that self isn't interested in performance. It's not asking you to be productive. It's inviting you to be whole, to integrate, to rest, to listen. And here's the paradox. When you stop resisting the void, it begins to change. What felt like numbness becomes clarity. What felt like apathy becomes peace. And eventually, a new kind of motivation emerges, not one based in fear or ego, but in alignment, in presence, in truth. You begin to move again, but it's not frantic. It's intuitive. You say yes to things that nourish your soul. You say no without guilt. You don't need a 5-year plan because your inner compass is finally online. This is how real transformation happens, quietly, in the dark, while no one's watching. So if you're in the void, honor it. Don't rush to fill it. Jung would remind you that the soul has seasons, and winter is not a mistake. It's a preparation. Stay with it long enough, and you'll see, the absence of motivation was never failure. It was the space your deeper life needed to arrive. There comes a moment in every deep spiritual journey that feels like death, but it's not the dramatic kind you might expect. It's quiet, subtle, and deeply disorienting. The kind of death where the you've always known quietly dissolves. No funeral, no eulogy, just a sudden absence of meaning in things that used to matter. You wake up and realize the identity you built, the one that chased achievement, approval, and certain no longer fits. And worse, you have no idea what comes next. Carl Jung described this not as a failure, but as a rite of passage, a symbolic death of the ego. And unlike the flashy promise of enlightenment many modern spiritual teachings offer, Jung emphasized something far less glamorous: the collapse of the structures you once used to define yourself. And that collapse, he said, is not optional, it is necessary. If you want to become whole, truly integrated, you have to lose who you thought you were. Let's be clear, the ego doesn't die in a literal sense. It doesn't disappear, but it does lose its dominance, its control. The ego, in Jungian terms, is the conscious personality, the mask you've worn to survive in society, what Jung called the persona. It's the version of you that knows how to play the game, succeed at the job, look good in public, and stay in line. It's not inherently bad. It's actually essential for functioning. But it's not the whole story of who you are. When awakening strips away this mask, your psyche enters a psychological limbo. You are no longer that old self, but the new self hasn't fully emerged. It's like being midair between trapeze bars. You've let go, but haven't grabbed the next one. And in that terrifying gap, there is no script, no role, no clarity, just raw awareness. Just you, naked before the truth. This limbo is where many seekers get stuck. Because everything in our culture tells us that uncertainty is bad. That not knowing what to do next means something's wrong. We're taught to fix, to plan, to move forward anything but pause. But Jung believed that this pauses, so-called nothingness, where the most vital work happens. You see, the death of the old identity creates space. And space is not a problem to solve. It's a sacred invitation. It is in this space that the unconscious begins to speak. Not in language or logic, but in symbols, dreams, body sensations, and intuition. Jung called this the symbolic life, a way of living where we listen not just with our ears, but with our whole being. And yet, most people rush to fill the void with something familiar. A new job, a new partner, a new belief system. But all of those are just new masks, unless they arise from the self, not the ego. The self, in Jungian terms, is not another persona. It's not another identity. It's the deepest center of your psyche, blueprint of wholeness within you. The self holds the opposites. It embraces the shadow, the light, the chaos, and the clarity. And to get there, you must pass through the limbo, the dark night of the soul. The goo phase, as some call it, the stage where the caterpillar turns to mush before becoming a butterfly. Jung knew how hard this transition is. He said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. Because facing your soul means facing what you've hidden from your grief, your rage, your fear, your unmet longing. But it also means facing your creative fire, your intuition, your sense of purpose beyond performance. And the truth is, the ego doesn't want that. The ego wants to stay in control. That's why this symbolic death feels so terrifying. Because it's not just a loss of motivation, it's a loss of identity, a loss of control, a loss of who you thought you had to be in order to be loved, successful, safe. But Jung would say, this loss is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom as in do whatever you want, but freedom from illusion, from the compulsive need to prove yourself, from the exhausting game of becoming enough in the eyes of others. So how do you navigate this phase without getting stuck? First, stop rushing. You are not broken, you are becoming. Second, don't spiritualize your numbness or disengagement. This isn't about transcending life. It's about re-entering it from a deeper place. Third, trust the symbolic language of your soul. Pay attention to your dreams, your gut reactions, the synchronicities that keep showing up. These are the breadcrumbs left by the self, guiding you forward not to another identity, but to wholeness. And finally, allow grief. Because letting go of an old identity is a death, and death deserves to be honored. Cry for the life that no longer fits. Mourn the goals you've outgrown. Say goodbye to the mask, not with judgment, but with gratitude. It got you here, but it can't take you further. This is the silent revolution Jung prepared us for. Not one of loud breakthroughs, but of quiet unraveling, a falling away that leads to something deeper, more grounded, more alive. You are not lost. You are in between. And that's exactly where transformation begins. After awakening, when the ego collapses and the world no longer fits the way it used to, many seekers fall into a subtle but dangerous trap: spiritual bypassing. On the surface, it looks like wisdom. You tell yourself, none of this matters. You say, it's all just an illusion, or I'm above all that now. You start meditating more, detaching more, maybe quoting ancient texts or sharing pretty spiritual content. But deep down, something doesn't feel right. You're not at peace, you're just numb, and you're not transcending pain, you're avoiding it. Carl Jung saw this tendency long before the term spiritual bypassing became popular. He didn't describe it with hashtags or high-vibe catchphrases. He called it inflation, when a person identifies with the divine, with light, with soul, but skips over the messy human part, over the shadow, over the real work. According to Jung, the shadow is everything you repress, reject, or can't see in yourself: your fear, envy, anger, shame, neediness, vulnerability. And spiritual bypassing is how many people unconsciously try to avoid facing that darkness. Instead of confronting their childhood wounds, they chant affirmations. Instead of sitting with grief, they quote, "Everything happens for a reason." They want to feel enlightened without going through the fire. But Jung was clear. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. You cannot skip the darkness and expect wholeness. The shadow doesn't vanish because you ignore it. In fact, it grows stronger the more you pretend it isn't there. You don't dissolve your trauma by labeling it illusion. You heal by entering it consciously, witnessing it, and integrating what's been split off inside you. Think about it this way. If your awakening led you to see the ego for what it is, a construct, and spiritual bypassing is just the ego putting on a new outfit. It no longer craves money or status, but now it wants to be seen as pure, enlightened, detached. It's still chasing identity. It's just using spiritual language to do it. This is why Jung emphasized individuation, not transcendence. He wasn't interested in becoming something otherworldly. He believed our highest task was to become fully human. That means facing not only your light, but your shadow. Not only your soul's beauty, but its ache, its history, its rage. Jung didn't see the goal as rising above life, but descending into it fully with your eyes open and your heart intact. So, what does going through the shadow actually look like? It means sitting with emotions that scare you, feeling your shame without needing to justify or fix it, letting your anger rise not to act it out, but to understand what boundary it's protecting. It means tracing the roots of your self-hate or your addiction, not to blame someone, but to reclaim your power. It means having the courage to feel deeply before you try to heal. It's messy, it's raw, it's profoundly human, but it's also the birthplace of soul. Jung believed that true wisdom is born from embracing paradox, the sacred and the profane, the divine and the broken, the clarity and the confusion. The self is not found in light alone. It is forged in the alchemical meeting of opposites, light and shadow. So if you find yourself floating above your life, detached from emotions, addicted to abstract truths, repeating spiritual slogans while quietly feeling empty, pause. You may be bypassing your own becoming. Come back to your body. Come back to your pain. Come back to the part of you that still longs to be known, not by an audience, not by a guru, but by you. That is the path Jung laid out. Not a path around suffering, but through it towards something deeper, truer, and more whole than anything illusion could offer. Eventually, if you stay with the silence long enough, if you resist the urge to rush back into productivity or chase clarity, you'll notice something begin to shift. It's subtle at first, not a thunderclap, not a voice from the heavens, just a quiet pull. A quiet, soul-level nudge toward life again. Not toward the life you left behind, but toward something new, something more honest. Carl Jung believed that this stage marks the emergence of what he called the self, the central, unifying force of your psyche that exists beneath the ego. While the ego is obsessed with performance, image, and approval, the self is interested in truth, wholeness, and meaning. And when the self begins to stir, it doesn't yell, it doesn't hustle, it whispers. This is the birth of soul-led motivation, where your old motivation came from lack. I'm not enough yet. I need to prove myself. I must be someone. This new energy comes from presence. It arises not because you're trying to escape who you are, but because you're finally becoming who you are. Jung saw this as a turning point in individuation. The ego, once in the driver's seat, starts to take a back seat not as an enemy, but as a helper. You stop needing to be someone, and instead, you start expressing something. Not because the world demands it, but because your soul does. You're no longer driven by external rewards, but by inner resonance. Things begin to feel different. Your choices, your goals, even your schedule. You may stop striving to build a life that looks good, and instead, start creating a life that feels good. At this point, even ambition transforms. It doesn't vanish, but it softens. It becomes devotional, not compulsive. You're still willing to work, to serve, to create. But now, it's not about proving your worth, it's about living your truth. You choose projects that align with your values, not just your resume. You say yes to opportunities that energize your soul, not just your bank account. And perhaps most profoundly, you begin to feel alive again, not in a flashy, high-performance way, but in a grounded, steady, deeply rooted way. This kind of motivation is immune to hustle culture. It doesn't spike from fear. It doesn't burn out after 3 days. It moves like breath, like rhythm. It knows when to act and when to rest. It honors timing, not urgency. It doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to be real. Jung called this living symbolically. Not in the sense of fantasy or metaphor, but in the sense of alignment. Your outer life begins to reflect your inner reality. The dreams that call you now aren't ego-driven, they're soul-shaped. You may feel drawn to write, to teach, to heal, to build, but it won't be about status. It'll be about service, expression, integration, and that's the shift. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What is life asking of me?" You stop asking, "How do I win?" and start asking, "What feels most true?" And in that space, something miraculous happens. The energy returns, not the frantic adrenaline of ego, but the sustainable fire of authenticity. So, if you've felt empty after awakening, if you've been drifting without purpose, understand this: your old fuel is gone. That's true. But something deeper is now waiting to ignite. You're not lazy. You're being restructured. Your inner compass is recalibrating not towards success, but towards selfhood. And when the self begins to lead, you won't have to force your path anymore. You'll feel it unfold beneath your feet, tone honest step at a time. So here you are, no longer lost, but no longer playing the same game. The illusion has burned away, and something deeper is now at the helm. You're no longer living for applause, validation, or the illusion of control. You're starting to live from the self, your quiet inner core that doesn't need to impress, only to express. Carl Jung called this living symbolically. That doesn't mean escaping into fantasies or metaphors. It means seeing life as sacred again. It means following meaning, not metrics. It means letting your life be guided not by the old voices that screamed, "Be more, do more," but by the quiet resonance of truth. That's the difference between performance and presence, between chasing life and finally participating in it. You begin to act, not from fear, but from alignment. You move with depth, not just drive. You make space for silence, for creativity, for joy, not because it's productive, but because it's real. And in that shift, everything starts to feel more alive again. Even the ordinary becomes rich with insight. Even the small moments carry depth. You're not here to play a role anymore. You're here to live a story only you can tell. So, if this journey resonates with where you're heading, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. What part of this awakening process are you in right now? Are you in the fog, the void, or just starting to feel that quiet inner spark again? And if you want to keep exploring the deeper layers of psychology, shadow work, spiritual integration, and soul-led living, subscribe to Fractal Wisdom. This is a space for real conversations. No sugarcoating, no spiritual bypassing, just truth, depth, and insight for the pathless path you're walking. Because awakening isn't the end of the story, it's where the real one begins.